So thank you. First of all, thank you to everyone in attendance. My name is Serena Maria Daniels. I'm a local news fellow with First Draft. Is a nonprofit organization that is working to track and research and ultimately combat the spread of online misinformation. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded. At the bottom of the screen, there is a chat box and a Q&A function. If you enter text into the chat box, it will be visible by all viewers. Text entered into the Q&A box will only be viewable by the moderators and panelists. So we invite you to ask questions throughout the presentation. As we all know, 2020 has been hit with an unprecedented number of challenges on a global scale, from the public health effects of the pandemic and our nationwide reckoning around racial injustice. This makes the need for reliable local news information more important than ever. However, as newsrooms shrink, so do their ability to ensure that the reporting efforts are representative of the communities that they serve. A news desert occurs when there are few to no reliable fact-checked sources of news in a particular area, and this is where misinformation is likely to thrive. So when we're talking about communities of color and whether they're unable to access that information, whether it's not reported on or it's not available in a language that they understand, they turn to unverified content online and via text message or other messaging apps such as WhatsApp to fill those voids. And so without the ability to decipher fact from fiction through this kind of content, or to understand the motives behind the content that is being shared online, this winds up becoming a recipe for mistrust in local media, and it creates greater harm to marginalized communities. In the weeks and months since the pandemic spread, throughout Michigan, we've seen several instances of misinformation, including accusations that mail-in voting is a plot to defeat the sitting president. This is an effort, for example, to suppress voter registration and participation. It also creates a dearth of critical information available, as I said, in languages that immigrant and Latinx communities can understand. That often leads to the spread of misinformation and also confusion when we're looking at many of the protests that have taken place over the past several weeks. We've seen lots of information and confusion online within these communities, these protest communities, and as well as kind of like a disconnect between local media and these communities. At First Draft in Pan America, we've been working with media and voters on how to understand the threats posed by misinformation, as recent international events surrounding the pandemic, as well as the Black Lives Matter protests, have shown us misinformation is incredibly harmful for communities as it attacks our trust in society and of each other. Amid civil unrest, an election this November, and the continuing effect of COVID-19, we believe it's critical to engage local voices on these issues. So today we're joined by several local journalists who are combating news deserts and thus the spread of misinformation through various efforts. And because this is a discussion, like I said, about communities, we want to make sure to give space for our viewers today to ask their own questions of the panelists. You know, of course, we as journalists have taken many approaches to addressing these sorts of issues. However, what's most important is to hear from you about your news needs. What are we missing? Where do you get your information? Do you read newspapers, TV? Are you getting it from these online communities? What do you need for us to do better to fill these voids? And so we'd like to start with quick introductions of our panelists. I will note that Sarah Alvarez of Outlier Media, unfortunately, was unable to join us today. However, We have several other journalists from Bridge Detroit, Planet Detroit. We have freelance journalists, and then we also have Nora Benavides from PEN America. Also joining us is a member of City Council in Detroit to kind of talk about her views in her own community and constituents. So let's go ahead and get started with introductions. Orlando, if you'd like to take the lead.
Sure. First of all, thanks to PEN America and First Draft for having me. Thank you, Serena, and to my fellow panelists. I am enthused and happy to be the only male voice on this panel. All too often I sit in spaces where we are the majority, and I am happy that I am in the minority today. My name is Orlando Bailey. I serve as the Director of Engagement for Bridge Detroit. Bridge Detroit is a new journalism and engagement organization that just started a couple of months ago. May 18th was our launch date, slap dab in the middle of a pandemic. And what we hope to do and are trying to do currently is have journalism that is directly influenced by residents in the city of Detroit. And I'll say more about that. I'll say more a little bit later on the makeup of our newsroom and all of that, but I want to keep it short and brief. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right, next we have is Raquel Castaneda Lopez.
Hi, good afternoon now. Thank you all so much for having me, as well as being, I would say, as a non-journalist person today. We just got out of city council session with quite a few contentious votes. And so I think it's super important the role that journalists play, especially informing people, in local communities. So I just want to thank the people who are part of organizations that really put in a lot of work and effort to make sure that communities are informed. And again, just honored to be here, a part of this panel, to have this very, very important conversation about combating misinformation and protecting people at the same time. So thank you.
And next we have is Nargis. Why don't you go ahead?
Hi, my name is Nargis Rahman, and I'm a freelance Bangladeshi American journalist. I do a lot of work to represent this community in Detroit, which is one of the larger minority communities within the city of Detroit, which is home to all immigrant and minority communities. So I look forward to speaking about that today.
Awesome, thank you, Nargis. And last but not least, we have Nina.
Hi, my name is Nina Ignazik. I am publisher and editor of the Planet Detroit newsletter, and we have been around for about a year. We focus on local environmental news, and there's certainly a lot of misinformation and underreporting in that space, and that's kind of the void we're trying to fill. So thanks so much for including me. I'm super excited to be here.
Awesome, thank you so much, Nina. Oh, you know what, my bad. We have Nora Benavides. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Serena. Well, I have to say it's great to be here. I work at PEN America and have been working for some time now with Serena and First Draft on this event. And I am pinch hitting, sitting on as a panelist. But I just want to say, one, it has taken, it's been a great feat putting such a great panel together. And I know how much Serena did in thinking through really carefully, like, what types of voices should be included, how we spotlight who's working with communities in really meaningful ways. So one, I want to thank Serena. From PEN America's side, we have a chapter in Detroit, and Detroit has a very special place for me. So I'm really thrilled now on my panelist hat to be here with all of you. And I run our media literacy work at PEN America. So I'm thrilled to talk about some of the ways that we need to be building trust in local news.
Thank you so much, Nora. Yeah, it's been an honor to work with you over the past couple of months to put this together. We're going to go ahead and jump right into some questions for our panelists. I'll go ahead and start with Orlando at Bridge Detroit. And please note that Bridge Detroit is a media news organization sponsor of First Draft. And so thank you so much for allowing me to kind of dive into some of these issues and trends that we've been noticing here in Michigan. So as you mentioned, you really hit the ground running over the past couple of months since you've launched. And what I'm really curious about, being a new media organization, what have you noticed about like some of the most critical data voids or underreported issues that you guys have encountered since your launch?
Yeah, that's really a good question, and I want to just take a step back to sort of provide a little bit of framework at how we look at things. We were intentional. Bridge Detroit was started by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Stephen Henderson, and what he set out to do was to create a newsroom that was reflective of the majority demographical makeup of the city of Detroit. Detroit is an 80% Black city, so most of our newsroom is Black, and we have a Latinx reporter in the newsroom as well. So, that's number one. I think the second thing that we set out to do was to first hear from Detroiters who are closest to the issues that we all care about and the issues that we may not even have known about, and figure out a way how we can engage the most marginalized Detroiters or Detroiters that have barriers that it's keeping them from thriving in an amazing quality of life, to tease out what their concerns are, what their information needs are, and then tailor our journalism to answer that. So we are a responsive journalism, service journalism organization. And so we were significantly challenged on the engagement side when we launched in the middle of a pandemic, because there's no real way to gather folks. And we understand that there is a technological gap, especially to the folks that we really, really want to talk to. And so early on, for the residents that we were able to engage and the community development organizations that partner with us, what we were hearing about is this concern about facial recognition technology and its use in the city of Detroit, and what Mayor Duggan and the chief were explaining it to be, but how it was working. So we've been running and following stories. There was a story of a young man who was arrested in Farmington off the use of facial recognition technology. And we know and understand that it disproportionately misidentifies people of color, especially Black folk. But the key piece of data that we are still trying to drill, and that we FOIA and all of that, and that is the facial recognition technology in Detroit has a specific contractor that is used, right? And we've been trying to get in touch with that contractor to figure out, where are these faces coming from? Where is this database of faces and information coming from? Is it from the Michigan State Police? Is it from the Secretary of State? We want to know how you got these faces, and we have yet to uncover that. That's the journey that we're on, and we feel that that is a key piece of concern for Detroiters, especially given that we have a citywide massive surveillance campaign known as Green Light, and that it misidentifies communities of color, and Detroit is a colored community. I think the second piece that we've worked on in partnership with Outlier, shout out to Sarah Alvarez who couldn't be with us, is really taking a close look at this unemployment fraud and how this algorithm works, and how folks have gone even to this day without receiving their unemployment benefits out of fear of fraud, and who that is affecting versus who it's not affecting. So we've been taking a really close look at the numbers around that. And then one of the other thing, and I'll yield, is this is an election year, this is a census year. COVID hit during tax season, so we had to extend tax. So all of these data gathering pieces, like the census and the voter electorate, are all things that we're looking into and trying to make sense of, in addition to figuring out how we can tell stories of low-wage workers who are now deemed essential, but they're still being a barrier to access quality health care. Because you're low wage, you're more than likely part-time, which means you more than likely don't qualify for employment health insurance. How are you accessing healthcare in the midst of a pandemic while you are still working every single day and being exposed to people? I'll stop there. I can go on, but those are just some of the things that we're looking at.
Yeah, and you brought up so many issues, and when we're in the middle of a crisis, what I've been noticing in my research is that people, the first thing that they do is reach out to their friends. They'll text each other, they'll put out a post on Facebook or Twitter, say, for example, we'll use the unemployment example of, you know, how do I access my benefits? I've got to say, like in the first few months of this crisis, that has to be like the #1 question. And yeah, to this day. And I know that Outlier has, I mean, they have been sitting and taking, you know, people will text them and gather, you know, their questions and try to troubleshoot for individuals. And so when you have all this confusion and this chaos going on, how do you get actual trustworthy information out to people to kind of dispel some of that chaos and confusion?
Yeah, I mean, we're a small newsroom, and you know, there are much larger newsrooms with an insane amount of revenue that can hire fact checkers and can really do a good job. We're doing it ourselves. And I think what goes a long way toward building trust is actually our motto. We are a newsroom that produces journalism by Detroiters for Detroiters. And so everyone in our newsroom is a Detroiter. And it is a different dynamic when folks are sort of parachuting in or commuting in and reporting on a community that they don't live in or are not a part of, versus when I am producing news for my neighbors, right? I got to go home at night and face my neighbors, and they got to, you know, they're going to be like, okay, what's going on? That wasn't right. You know, that was a mischaracterization. And so I think that goes a long way toward building trust, as well as the journalists that make up the newsroom, including myself as the director of engagement. I've been working in community engagement and development in the city of Detroit for the last 8 years. I have a ton of relationships all throughout the city. And I think leveraging those relationships with resident leaders, resident groups, and community development organizations to, you know, really get a sense of what's happening on the ground is key. And then us constantly asking ourselves questions to be careful not to perpetuate white normative narrative that is not conducive to how we consume information in Detroit, but also doesn't highlight or take into account the nuances that exist on the pavements in the city of Detroit that most traditional news organizations tend to look over. We hover in that area, right? And so I think very early on, we were able to build trust based off just who we were and the questions and the relationships the questions that we continue to ask and the relationships that we intend to build and to leverage.
I really appreciate what you have to say about that, because all too often in a lot of the traditional newsrooms in Detroit, a lot of folks, you know, whether it's parachuting from another part of the country or a major like national news organization or right here locally, where you have journalists who live in suburbs and who don't see the day-to-day. I think that makes a huge difference. And I think that's a great segue to lead into a question for Raquel, because you're not a journalist, but I think that right away, you started noticing things in your communities that no one was touching. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about some of those like critical data voids or information voids that you began seeing, and what your office has been kind of doing to address that.
Yeah, for sure. And again, thank you just for like setting the stage to have this conversation, because I think in all that was going on, some of it just gets missed, but the need and importance about how information is shared and the quality of the information is just really key. And so what we were super overwhelmed at the beginning, and many of you know this on the call. So my office in the constituency that I represent, I chair the immigration task force, and we champion kind of language access. And so given that, all of the language access requests were kind of being thrown at our office as the pandemic rolled out. And it was like, can you do sign language? Well, where's the Bengali version? And it's like, whoa, you know, like we as an individual office, one, don't have the capacity nor the skill set to be able to manage all this. And eventually, I think the city stepped up and did a much better job. But it was simply one, from a language access standpoint, the pandemic definitely highlighted the deep, deep divides and lack of investment in language access that still exists. And not even from like, I need information in another language besides English, but also for interpretation and for things to be put out for people who have hearing and visual disabilities. Those demographics were kind of completely forgotten about and then added as an afterthought. And so that was a tremendous kind of burden and I would say more of a responsibility to kind of take on and to push the conversation forward, where there's folks who are asking for it, and then there's resistance or frustration, like, why do you keep asking about translation services, right? And at the same time, I think something Orlando also talked about is just people, even if once it was translated, were hesitant to then maybe participate in things for lack of understanding of the content. So one is literally translating the information into people's languages or into Braille or into ASL. The other piece is what I call kind of decoding content. So it's not super, university level academic, and it's in lay people's terms so that it's accessible to folks in a way that they feel they can understand it and it's not intimidating, but there's also a level of trust built. Because as someone who also grew up in the city and grew up in poverty, there's a lot of intimidation to opening mail, even sometimes, and to reading documents, because fear it's a bill collector or you're gonna a fine for some reason. There's just that fear. And I remember with my parents and my mom for sure, being the main person to kind of go and sort through mail to make sure we weren't missing stuff, because there's just this level of intimidation of like official looking documents. And so I think that's another piece that definitely came up in thinking about how to translate things in a way that that I guess recognizes people's humanity and just empathetic. That may sound weird and crazy, but I think that's a really important piece of information sharing, is recognizing some of the fears and barriers that people carry with them, and why they may shy away from like official information sources and be pushed more towards, the ones that they feel have more maybe familiarity or street credibility, but really are sharing incorrect information at times. So it was a very overwhelming, exhausting time period, I think, in my life as a whole. I will not forget. But that said, I think a lot was pushed, and you did a great job, Serena, as well, with local folks helping to translate, both literally as well as kind of figuratively, and filling the voids of, there's such a demand for information, and kind of filling the voids for that information around just basic services, basic resources, information. And what we're seeing now, I think, as the civil unrest conversation unfolds, is the same level of interest in people wanting to engage who might not be native English speakers or may use ASL or some other way of communicating, but they want to know and want to be involved and want to know what the articles are saying and the different opinions being put out. And we're seeing, again, just a lack of information being put out in these other languages that are engaging people in the non-English speaking community in an authentic way. So I definitely still think that's a demand and a need that just is ongoing.
Right, definitely. I think that in recent weeks and months, in light of a lot of the civil unrest that's been taking shape across the country, people are kind of taking to private groups or text messaging options to spread the word of, oh, hey, there's a demonstration taking place at Patton Park, or oh, we heard, for example, there was, a group of protesters that were hit by a DPD police vehicle. And a lot of rumors swirled around there, and a lot of hurt. And, you have the official voices saying, well, it was justified or what have you, but there still remains a lot of people who are talking amongst themselves about, well, what really happened, and feeling a disconnect between local media and these movements. I'm going to transition a little bit to Nora. You obviously have been keeping an eye on a lot of this stuff across the country. And so can you tell us a little bit about how misinformation has infiltrated a lot of our news feeds? Just kind of like give us a wide scope perspective of what you've been seeing.
Sure, I'm happy to. I think so much when we imagine what's happening in Detroit and the kind of distrust that we are seeing and have seen for so long, where traditional media is concerned, is then compounded by all of these recent issues we've seen. And I think it would be a mischaracterization to call the recent protests a crisis, because I think it's actually really something we should be celebrating and excited about from a civic engagement perspective. But where misinformation is concerned, it absolutely has contributed to more proliferation of misleading content. And so I remember, I mean, it feels like, what, 7 years ago to think about March. You know, and I know Raquel mentioned how crazy that period was. I mean, it feels like so long ago, but there were issues that started springing up that we were monitoring around the whole country. You know, as people started sharing information, oftentimes thinking they were doing the right thing. You know, they would share things out of almost a sense of civic duty, where maybe gargling with saline will help kill coronavirus in your mouth. Then I think scientists were able to, for the most part, successfully launch information campaigns about all of the misinformation regarding saline, regarding bleach, regarding practices that could be incredibly dangerous for you. But the question really was front and center for people of, how do I get credible information right now? And it, to me, was a turning point for local outlets and local journalists who were suddenly in demand. They were seen as these vanguards for truth in a way, where it was like local reporters, and I see Orlando nodding. Like, I remember this moment where it was like all these local reporters suddenly were just in demand, and it was like they're on the front lines in a way. And so I was frankly really personally excited to see, for the first time in a long time, discussion about how local news can combat disinformation or misinformation. And we could talk a little bit, I guess, about the distinctions of that, you know, later. But when the protests then started springing up in May, you know, first in Minneapolis and then around the country, there were other forms of misinformation that started cropping up in news feeds. And much of that was really horrible bad actors trying to convince people that protests were happening when they weren't. So luring people out to unsafe environments. There were fake and bogus Gmail accounts that I was monitoring with some of my reporter colleagues and even activists on the ground in various cities, who would get messages from people saying, hey, I got some notice that there's a protest happening, or I heard that this person started a fire with a Molotov, you know, cocktail. Like, is that true? And some of these people then who were called out were then targeted online. You know, they were trolled and doxxed. And I mean, there was just sort of this really horrible deluge of issues. And then people started saying, well, anti-lockdown protesters were dealt with differently. You know, are they safe and peaceful? Now we're seeing this horrible sort of rampant violence. There were questions around whether white nationalists, which has been confirmed, whether white nationalists were infiltrating in person in these protests to stoke violence. I mean, the kind of swirling of confusion, compounded by then misinformation around the pandemic itself, really created this, I don't want to say perfect storm, but it was like a perfect storm of, you couldn't believe anything you saw. Videos of protests back in June showing things that were misattributed videos from years ago, which is frankly a very common tactic we see a lot, is just misattributed content, which makes people think something is happening right now or yesterday when it isn't. We saw that in the pandemic context when food infrastructure was targeted, videos of people in Germany shopping and hitting each other. And that was from 2013. It was a really kind of well-known and viral video. We then saw it with the protests. And so all of this seems to just, and part of what PEN America does is talk through with communities how misleading content can weaken our trust in each other and in our institutions, which is honestly at its heart the point of misinformation and disinformation. It thrives in an environment where we begin to doubt what Orlando and I consider our shared sense of belief, or what Nargis and you, Serena, are able to connect on. And so, yes, there are the concerns that drinking bleach can hurt you. Yes, but that's also easy to target and try to minimize its harmful effect. Yes, people are getting fake and bogus emails about protests, but in a much larger sense, when we think about how we already have very little and often waning trust in local news, to see then this online environment that is playing into people's divisiveness and breaking down our discourse. Part of what my biggest concern is how do we think about giving them the tools and giving reporters the opportunity, frankly, for these types of conversations to say, hey, we're here and we're providing really credible information for you. And communities need to learn how to look to that. So I'll stop there. And
I just add to what you were saying just really quickly. What's coming up for me is the delineation between misinformation and disinformation, because I think there is a difference. And when you talk about the encouragement on part of an individual that I just don't even want to name in this conversation, for citizens to drink bleach, that is deliberate disinformation. That's information that's given out that is deliberately wrong and misleading. And
right.
So I think we are combating two things. We're combating the spread of misinformation, things that folks think may be true that isn't accurate, and then the putting out of disinformation, especially on folks that are powerful within the power structures of this country and the world. And it is, yeah, I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's useful. I mean, it's useful to have a sense of what the different terms are. I also think that the general public has no sense for the most part, and not because of like ignorance, but because these terms evolve. I mean, fake news was a term we used in 2015 and 16. It's still a term that some can use accurately to talk about fake news, but it's been commandeered and co-opted. You know, disinformation, maybe this is useful, Serena, very briefly, I'll just say, like, disinformation is really information that is created that is false with the intent to deceive people. And misinformation is really just wrong or mistaken, and often can be in error. So what started out as disinformation, bad actors posting something online, if I were to share it thinking I'm actually helping people to learn more, that could then turn into misinformation. And what we've seen for the most part is actually just misattributed malinformation recently, where things that aren't fully false, they're just in the wrong context and adapted to make you think something else. That is the majority of what recent pandemic and protest related content has been.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess before we move on to our first batch of questions, I would just like to add to that a lot of how this information spreads really plays into our own personal beliefs. And so when we have fears about where we're going to receive, when we're going to receive our unemployment check, or you know, what's going to happen if I go to that protest, or you know, if I go out to vote in person, will I get infected? Or if I send out my mail-in ballot, is it going to be fraudulent? Like, these are questions that we're already experiencing because we're in a state of chaos. And then we see folks who are disseminating disinformation, who are playing into those fears and vulnerabilities and taking advantage of it. And so I think it's really important for us to be very critical about the kind of content that we're viewing online. If you're seeing an ad, if you're being invited to a group or what have you on Facebook, and it's using kind of like inflammatory language or content that makes you feel a certain way, like a really specific way, you've got to stop for a second and pause and think about whether you want to spread that and amplify that narrative. But this is a great conversation so far. I'm going to go ahead and move it on to, we have our first questions. Our first question is from Melissa Hager. Are the effects of adverse childhood experiences being addressed in Detroit? So that's not personally a topic that I've been seriously enmeshed in. I'm not sure if anyone on the panel has some insights, or it sounds like this is a topic of maybe a data void, an example of a data void, or something that's unreported. Anything from our panelists? Do you have any thoughts? What we can do as well is take this down and take down the question and then perhaps follow up offline. Just to add, just to be clear, we'll go ahead and provide our contact information at the end of this presentation. And so if we're not able to get to the question now, then we're certainly happy to follow up and maybe discuss a little bit further about what you mean. But let's see, moving right along. We've got some more questions for the panelists. We haven't talked to Nina a whole bunch quite yet. And so, you know, you're really hitting a niche in your style of reporting. You're focused on environmental journalism. And so, like you mentioned, you're also a pretty new news organization, and you're touching on a very specific topic. But you know, with regards to what's going on today, when we're talking about the environment and especially communities of color during, you know, these kind of layers of crises, you know, how do you approach environmental journalism?
Yeah, so I'll start with water shutoffs, and I know not everybody here is from Detroit, but you most likely have heard about the water shutoffs that have gone on in the city over the last 5 or 6 years. And you may know that right as the pandemic was hitting, the governor and the mayor decided finally to put a moratorium on water shutoffs, because all of a sudden it seemed very strange to be telling people to wash your hands when you had no way to wash them because your water had been shut off due to non-payment. And we know that the people whose water shut off are largely, you know, very low income, often single family, Black women-headed households in the city. So I think one thing that the pandemic made clear was that link between water shutoffs and public health. And I know while the issue had been reported on in the past, I don't think it had been reported on in that framework as a public health issue. And I think that's something that we're trying to do. I think it was reported on as an economic issue, as a municipal finance issue, as an issue of fairness, but certainly not as a public health issue. And that's, I think, something that COVID changed. I think that more media are starting to think in those terms. But I think that it's something that we have some work to do on. So I know there is a broad range of issues that affect low-income Detroiters and communities of color, some of which are being reported on, some of which aren't. But very little of that reporting is really honing in on that nexus between those issues and how they impact the environment and can cause health issues and harm. I know that there's a robust literature out there on social determinants of health. I think the adverse childhood experiences that were mentioned in the question are one of those. But we don't tend to bring them up that often in our reporting, and I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's because the solutions aren't easy, you know, it's not clear to make links between topics, or just that we've really deprioritized and defunded public health kind of as an institution. But I think going forward, we need to start thinking about, you know, seemingly unconnected issues like evictions or lack of access to education or lack of access to the internet. Even, you know, things like dumping and trash, you know, mundane issues, in terms of what the public health outcomes, both physical and mental, are to communities. And so I'd like to see us doing more of that. I'd also like to see us kind of extrapolating that out to then what are the costs borne not only by those specific communities, but by society as a whole. So I think there's a few kind of underreported topics that can lend themselves, I think, to misinformation. One topic I think is lead and lead poisoning. We just did a story in Planet Detroit about the new testing data that's coming out under the Michigan's new lead and copper water rule, which has kind of a more robust testing protocol. And I was really shocked at some of the data that is publicly available data. I had just never looked at it. In places like Melvindale that are approaching like Flint level water, you know, during the crisis, like levels of lead in the water that we saw in Flint. How is that story not being told? And I think that the potential for misinformation there is that, you know, we may focus a lot on, well, we've changed the action level and, you know, here's all these communities with very high level, but we know, and the public health experts repeat time and again, that there is no safe level of lead to have. So I think that's a potential point of misinformation when we say, well, we're below the action level, but what, you know, what is happening individually? And lead testing is expensive, so not everybody gets their lead tested in communities. And I know there's work in Flint to try to change that and build like community lead labs that are doing water testing. I think the other issue that is kind of underreported and tends to have potential for disinformation is the air pollution in our region. I don't think we have a handle on it. I don't think we have a handle on what kind of air pollution we're exposed to and the actual harm that it's doing to not only communities of color, but frankly, anybody in our airshed. We're not really looking into that data, questioning the data, and especially looking at cumulative exposures and what that means in terms of people's exposures, people's risk, and how that feeds into the regulatory system that doesn't necessarily take those issues into account. So those are some of the things we're trying to do. And then lastly, I think there's been a tendency in a lot of media and a bias towards discounting the input and stories of environmental activists because, you know, as journalists, we tend to look askance at anybody that may have an agenda. But not only that, you know, a lot of these people who are activists in their communities may not have a science background or a college degree. But I think it's a huge mistake. I think we need to be reporting on those issues and including those voices in our reporting and listening to what they're telling us, because I think in a lot of cases they're closer to the information than some of the other sources that we tend to go to kind of through more official institutional channels. So those are sort of my prepared remarks for the session. But yeah, I think there's just a lot of information out there. I think the environment may seem like a niche topic, but it's much broader than I think we think about or we give it credit for when we start thinking about how all of these things actually affect the areas in which we live and impact our health. I think there's more linkages there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you touched on a lot of points there. You know, for example, in what Orlando brought up earlier, you know, just kind of like the fact that, you know, a lot of journalists do tend to follow the official word. They follow what the police chief said. They follow what, you know, Marathon Petroleum said, but not actually taking into account the people who are on the ground and talking about these issues and who are actually impacted by them and what they're noticing. And I'm sure Raquel also would agree. I know that a lot of folks in your district, actually where I live as well, are that's one of the huge topics that is talked about in communities, but not necessarily taken seriously in a lot of news spaces. I'm going to go ahead and switch it up because after my first Q&A call, we got quite a few additional questions. This one comes from Clara Hendrickson. She's actually a reporter from the Detroit Free Press. So thank you for your question. And what are the tools and ways to ensure that local reporting is working to answer questions Detroiters have? What are some of the ways to strengthen community ties during COVID when meeting in person is more difficult?
That is a good question, and I think it is a question that we are tackling with right now. One of the things that we don't want to do at Bridge is sort of reinvent the wheel and create an additional layer or hoop for residents to jump through when we know that a lot of residents' first stop is to their neighborhood community development organization, right? Before they call the city council person, before they call a city representative, they're gonna stop in or call their local CDC. And so what we have been trying to do and have done in an okay fashion for the time that we're living in is partner with community development organizations that are still serving residents on the ground, whether if that whether if they're providing food, PPE, direct services for young people, and trying to have these really amazing, safe introductions through these CDCs to talk to residents about what their concerns are. And because the CDCs are trusted, the relationship with us is beyond transactional. So what I've been hearing when I talk to a lot of residents around what their relationship to traditional media is, it feels very transactional. I don't always know the angle. I don't know if they're going to take my words and twist them. And one of the things that we're trying to build at Bridge Detroit is a community priorities model that is iterative, not one-off, right? So I want to talk to you, but I don't want to talk to you just this one time. I want to build a relationship with you. And if you feel comfortable, utilize you as a source. And that is monumental in my view for a couple of different reasons. One, because resident voice have not always been valued as a voice of expertise, right? We hear from public officials, we go to press conferences, and we take those quotes and we utilize them in the story. Yeah, I'm gonna go to the press conference, I'm gonna ask the question, I'm gonna get a quote, but then we're gonna build this bridge, whereas we hold up the intent of power versus the effect of power on the ground, and hear from residents who have that lived expertise and honor them by, you know, qualifying and providing agency for them in our stories. And so we're doing that as best we can now. I was a person who got sick early on in the pandemic and suffered a lot of loss of friends and things. And so I'm not entirely super comfortable going out. I still struggle sometimes going to the grocery store, going out and knocking on doors, but eventually we will get there. That was my vision. I come from the streets, born and raised on the east side of Detroit, got my chops in community organizing for a nonprofit, knocking on doors, telling people about their homes being a property tax foreclosure, talking about an indoctrination into, you know, trauma-filled community work. That's where I come from, you know, hitting the pavement and hitting the streets. And so until we're able to do that again, we're trying to be as calculated and safe as possible when building these relationships. And we want to build a relationship beyond this transactional field that a lot of Detroiters with experience with media organizations feel.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, that's definitely a challenge for a lot of us who are journalists who survive and thrive off of having that sort of engagement and that connection with our own communities. I think it's especially important for journalists of color as well to be able to know intimately firsthand, you know, what it is that the concerns are of our family members, of our neighbors and stuff like that, and be able to use that knowledge to convey it to the rest of the world and to kind of shine a light on what's going on. And that leads me to Nargis. You are a freelance journalist, you're a Bangladeshi American, you're a mom, you kind of wear those hats very proudly in all of your reporting. And you've, like the rest of us, have had to deal with having to pivot the direction of our reporting. Can you talk about that a little bit and how your focus has really changed over the past few months?
Yeah, so definitely I want to say that everything has been on pause besides COVID right now. And I think the first thing that came to mind as a Bangladeshi American is, what does this mean for our community? What does it mean for communities that are oftentimes left off the table, even within the South Asian communities, often forgotten about and often talked about in a negative light? So I always try to find a positive spin on things that are even, you know, upsetting, like the pandemic. And how do we bring people together? How do we kind of find the commonalities and what is being shared? How do we share that information amongst everyone pretty equally? So one of the questions I've been asking a lot during my reporting, when I've been talking to official people, for example, doctors or the director of the health director in the city of Detroit, is what does this mean for people who cannot go on the CDC website and look it up, or will not go on the City of Detroit website to look up these translated documents? How do we get this information to people in a very digestible, easy to understand way? And then it falls on the responsibility of, say, you know, multiple generations of folks, for example, the kids of first-gen parents, relaying that information back to their parents and trying to keep up with the information that's changing. One of the things I've also noticed is that the rate of translation isn't happening as fast for communities of color. So although information is being updated often in the media and we're finding new information as the pandemic goes along, we don't have the equivalent of that in the communities of color. So things that people are finally maybe understanding now in the Bangladeshi community might have been things that, you know, the general population has already understood and moved on in a month ago or 2 months ago. For example, what I've been hearing the most is that people really want to know what are the basic things every person should know and should be practicing. And that's literally hand washing, wearing a mask, social distancing. So whether I've been talking to health experts or just everyday people, those are the two things that I think that people are not making that connection and saying, hey, this is the same all across the board. You know, whether you're just a person staying at home and trying to stay safe and healthy, you should be doing the same exact thing as what health experts are also doing. And these are the basic things you need to know. I've also been asking questions in terms of how are the people getting this information? And speaking to what Raquel mentioned earlier, language access. So beyond translating documents, you know, making videos is very popular for communities of color. And a lot of our you know, first gen Bangladeshi Americans are on Facebook now, right? So like my parents are on Facebook. I never thought that would happen, right? But there they are, and that's where they're looking for information. And then they are also sharing information in WhatsApp groups, oftentimes conspiracy theories, right? That are not, it's not that, you know, a lot of times the kids are not able to vet out those, you know, conspiracy theories for their parents until it gets passed down to them. And then they can say, hey, that's not true, make sure you do this. And then there's that aspect of culture. So in communities of color, oftentimes people rely on community leaders to get information. And there isn't like one guy or one gal to go to. There is often different people from different spaces. So the imams from the mosques, or the council members from the community, or the local businessman. So in traditional times, you know, when it's not the pandemic, people go to gathering spaces at restaurants or mosques or community centers to get this very basic information in the most impactful way. And because of the pandemic, now we are in a space and time where who do we look to? Because we can't go and meet in person and have that personal engagement like Orlando was talking about. There's no one to really connect with, put a face to. And those people might not always have the most accurate information either, right? So the imams are not getting the information at the same accuracy level as perhaps the council members of the community might. And so how do we make sure that everyone has the same information and that it's readily available? In the Detroit area, there's a Bangladeshi newspaper called Bangla Shangbad, which does provide information in Bangla. And right now they're starting to look into, you know, publishing things in English, but primarily they're still in Bangla, because Bangladeshi people primarily still need information in Bangla. And no matter how much information the CDC posts, or the City of Detroit, or the City of Hamtramck will post about the pandemic, people are still looking for things in their language, native language, the most easy to understand, that can be shared often and quickly to understand what's going on. Even if it's available and they can read it, that's not the primary place that they're going to look for that information. So when I was doing a story for Tostada magazine, one of the people I spoke to was the founder, publisher of Bangla Shangbad, and he said the same thing, that people are looking to us for information. We're trying to translate information as much as possible and make videos and make things that can be shared online. But there's still a lot of learning, there's still a learning gap in terms of when you're the journalist, kind of balancing both worlds and trying to make sense on both ends, what people need on this side and what people want on the other side, and plus the multiple generations that you're serving in your population. I think that I also tend to interview, like Serena said, I try to think as a mom and think as a woman. I try to include more women voices when I'm looking for information, because sometimes I think that is lacking in our reporting, especially in the Bangladeshi community. A lot of the people who are our representatives are men, and so therefore they're not accessible. I wouldn't, for example, just you know, if I'm thinking about reaching out to a friend who might be a credible source, I'm probably first going to reach out to a woman and then maybe a male to get information as a mom, you know, when it comes to parenting or things like that. And I think even when it comes to the pandemic, that's how people think. They text or hit up their friend. It's probably somebody who's relatable to them. So I think that I try to cover those aspects of my reporting in there as well.
Yeah, definitely. And you really hit on some important issues and things that I think a lot of folks who speak only English like never even think about. Like, we have a privilege to like protect our health because of our language. Like, if you think about it, like we have more right to be alive in a sense if we have access to the tools that we need to protect ourselves. And so it's really critical that we're able to communicate in whatever way whatever shape that takes place. And I know a lot of families where perhaps the kids grew up speaking, you know, Bangladeshi or Spanish. They speak it perfectly fine in the household and amongst their friends and family, but when they go out into the world, you know, without having that formal language education, you know, the idea of writing an entire article or translating a whole story into, you know, what is their household language is not accessible. And so the idea of sharing videos and other kind of alternate means of credible information is more crucial than ever. And that kind of goes back to, you know, what Raquel had been working on over the past few months. I know that you were able to share some videos as well in different languages when, you know, the idea of, you know, creating a written infographic was kind of like, you know, too cumbersome, and you just had to get that information out. And going back to you, Raquel, let me see, I had some more questions. Okay, and so, you know, as an elected official, you know, you're obviously thinking about a lot of these things over the next several months, and thinking about the upcoming elections in November. And so what do you see the role of misinformation? How do you see that will play out in your communities? And how are you working with your constituents to build trust in our institutions to help promote civic engagement?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to a question maybe that was asked of Orlando earlier about just, or maybe someone, the reporter from the Free Press asked, it's about investment, I think, and it's about listening, and not on this transactional way that happens one time. It's really about transforming that relationship, and in a way that also doesn't extort people for information or for their resources. So in addition to devaluing, but just also not extorting them for things. And so for us, it's always been super important to be out in the community. There are definitely greater health concerns. And so historically, we usually door knock, and so we're not able to do that, but we're able to do literature drops. And so it's kind of being aware, and I'm not sure who mentioned this, maybe Nargis mentioned this, of what are the platforms that communities are using. So we know for our Arab speaking population, WhatsApp, it's like these WhatsApp broadcast lists, that's how they share. So my staff member, shout out to Hanan Yaya, my team, was able to build that relationship and join some of these other lists to be able to kind of like share information. And if there's inaccurate information being posted there, to be like, hey, actually, you know, this is the correct info. Here's a video, here's a flyer, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of building those relationships so you have access then to those platforms that communities traditionally use to get information out, I think is really, really key. and being sensitive to, I think Nargis also mentioned this, to some of the gender dynamics and identity politics that play out in different communities. Like I'm a Latina, right? And there's machismo still within the Latino community. And so recognizing that as a woman in many different regards, the interpretation and impact of my gender and how people perceive that at times. So again, just being aware of that, accessing the platforms and building relationships with folks so that you have access to the platforms that they usually use. I think as it relates to the upcoming elections and even how that ties to the census, because they're similar timelines, it's about, again, valuing people beyond just that ask. So it's not like we go out and say, okay, hey, we need you to vote. It's like, what's going on? What do you still need? And a lot of the work that we're still doing now is around, basic COVID-19 stuff and connecting people to basic services so that they have food and shelter and water and things like that. And then it's like, hey, do you need additional information? Have you gotten your absentee ballot yet? But when you lead from a place of like, this is what I need you to vote, and I'm going to ask you about voting, and I don't even like acknowledge or give you space to share all the other concerns and needs that you have, then people don't necessarily listen. And as a person, honestly, who my mom didn't vote until she was like in her mid-50s. And I think I started voting in my early 20s. And part of it was there wasn't this conversation about the importance was there, but it was also this sense of distrust and not feeling valued and not feeling ever heard or listened to. And so recognizing that and not chastising people, not being like, oh, you horrible person because you're not voting, like recognizing like, yo, I get it. Like, I understand our communities are left behind and that's frustrating. And how do we like do something about it? And having that honest conversation with them versus chastising or walking away or disengaging with folks because they're not doing what you're asking them to do. So I think that's another key piece. We often put the onus on the person we're trying to engage. We're like, well, it was in the free press, you should have read the article, right? Or what was on this website, you should have got the information. And it's like, no, again, the onus falls on us. And I say this maybe as an elected official, for sure. And I guess as journalists, yeah, to meet people where they're at, to make the information accessible on platforms that communities actually use. And I know there's competition, of course, and it's like, well, who's going to get the story first or who gets the quote from this person? But recognizing that there's a greater human need to have, truthful content for our overall well-being and safety. And I think taking a step back in humility and being like, okay, it's okay if I didn't give that first interview, this is what I need to make sure is put out to the community. And the last piece I would just say is really partnering with small ethnic media outlets or just smaller outlets, which there's a newspaper, for example, The Telegram, which does a great job. And there's several zip codes that really pay attention to this. And so reaching out to them to make sure they're engaged and that, you're passing content onto them because they may not have the staff capacity or whatever it is to disseminate this information in communities that trust them as an outlet. So yeah, on our end, we'll be doing literature drops. To the point about the videos, I honestly got tired. It was a lot, you all, of just like, and still to this day, it's like, you need to do a video about everything in Spanish and in Arabic, and you need to, because I'm an elected official, it's like, if you say it, then everyone will believe you. And I'm like, no, I don't think that's true. But it's just a lot to manage people's expectations and to kind of push the responsibility to colleagues, because it really is a responsibility of all of us and not just me. So it's just my personal venting on that piece. But yeah, I think I kind of meet people where they at, build trust to access the networks that they use and share information in that way, uplift and elevate the voices of smaller ethnic minority media that already has that trust in the community. And making sure, again, you're building relationships over time and covering stories they reach out to you to cover and not just when you think it's exciting or sensational.
Right. And what you're touching on definitely is this idea about service journalism, when we're not chasing after like the major headline, but we're saying like, okay, this is actually really critical information that we need to touch on, and it's not reaching everybody. So like, even just like providing that very basic, like, where can I pick up food for my school children who, all of a sudden they don't have access to free breakfast or lunch. And by providing that kind of information, you're broadening the scope of what it means to be a reporter and looking at it from a perspective of like, what can I do in service of the people that I'm representing? I'm going to move on to a couple of questions. This one, let's see, and I'm going out of order. I will go ahead and reach the different questions. But this one comes from Andrew Rockway. The speaker has noted that news and misinformation is often spread through family and peer networks. How are you all situating your reporting to be attuned for that kind of social sharing? Perhaps Nargis or Orlando, or perhaps.
I'll yield to Nargis first, and then I'll.
Thank you. So I want to say the biggest thing that I understood from my reporting is that, you know, people want to know information from still those community leaders, but they want to be able to pass things on in WhatsApp. So the way to do that is really to have conversations with your friends and family. And I think that that by reporting on the story about misinformation is opening that dialogue to have that conversation at home with your family and your friends about not spreading misinformation and disinformation. I think that's really where that kind of comes in. So I think as the role of the journalist is to bring up that this is an issue and that you need to find trusted sources. And here are a couple that we're going to include in our article. And this is an article that can be shared on WhatsApp and Facebook. So please have that conversation when you're able to. And also linking back to the ethnic media, you know, going back and having it also shown on their platforms and shared by that spokesperson from the publisher from Bangla, for example, is a trusted voice in the community. So showing that, hey, he's also on par with where, you know, kind of what we're all talking about. Something that also came to mind was the misinformation of reporting COVID deaths was an issue particularly that that we talked about. So for example, a lot of people have been also, you know, passing away during this pandemic time, but have never been tested or never officially knew whether or not they had COVID and perhaps had COVID-like symptoms. And so one thing that, you know, Iqbal made me aware of was to be very careful about spreading misinformation about how many people have died from COVID in the Bangladeshi community even, because this information may seem like a little dent in the bigger picture in terms of local reporting, but this kind of information gets relayed back to people like in Bangladesh. And families are really impacted by this kind of fake news, and it can be detrimental to hear that someone has passed away from a, you know, a pandemic virus and disease and like not even know, right? And then people are just spreading this information on Facebook. And so primarily the deaths in the Bangladeshi community have been shared on Facebook. And I asked Iqbal, how do you know that these people actually died from the virus as well? And one of the things he said is, you know, it's really kind of word of mouth, right? So it's kind of like, do I know the person who's sharing it? Is it really their family member or somebody, you know, that can actually verify that information without, you know, without kind of in short of asking for a death certificate to prove it? And also being mindful if the family is okay with you sharing that information about their loved one passing away from a virus, because in communities of color, these kind of things are almost taboo to talk about, you know. And so some people I've seen have been very open about it and said, hey, you know, our loved one passed away from the virus. If you have been in contact with them, you know, get tested or self-quarantine if you need to. But for the most part, people are very uncomfortable to share that kind of information, and it's super taboo. And so some of the things that I also wondered out loud kind of was about cultural norms. So for example, in the Bangladeshi community, when an elderly person gets ill and people perceive that that person may be passing away soon, and I'm sure this is true in many communities of color in general, like if your grandma's really sick, you're gonna go see grandma before she perhaps gets really, you know, more ill or is on her deathbed. But in COVID times, it's kind of difficult to have those conversations and weigh out the pro and con of whether you should go actually see grandma and get her, you know, even more sick or spread symptoms if you don't know you have COVID, or you're you know, if you can spread it without knowing that you even had it, or to what extent do you follow cultural norms in a pandemic, and you know, to the other extent of not following any cultural norms at all? How do you kind of balance those two things? That's something that came up as well. And also another thing that I think that we didn't cover was how like the information of COVID or someone having COVID impacts communities of color. For example, if it's a small business owner and saying that someone had COVID at the store, just the way like if we hear someone had COVID at the local Myers, you know, a lot of people are going to mentally check out and not go to Myers, right? Even if that employee is on break and resting and the whole place was sanitized, we're not really thinking about that. We're thinking more so we're not going Myers anymore or that Myers anymore. And so when you have something like that happen in a small business realm, a lot of these small businesses are owned by multiple partners. That is their sole income for the whole family. And perhaps they're still pretty close to poverty or low income families, right? So they're depending on that small business to thrive, especially in the pandemic. It's already, you know, suffering. And we know that a lot of small businesses didn't get big loans, right? So on top of that, if you have somebody spread a rumor and say, hey, this particular store had an employee who had COVID, whether, you know, without knowing if that's accurate or inaccurate, you put people in a situation where they not only lose their, you know, their business, but they lose the livelihood that they were able to provide for their families. And that business, you know, potentially can never open again. It's not able to bounce back. It doesn't kind of just go away with time. It really just closes after that. And so we've been seeing that in the Bangladeshi community as well as harmful things like that have been spread, rumors, and people are avoiding grocery stores because of that. So that's the kind of things that I've noticed that are happening with the pandemic specifically.
Yeah, no, definitely. You touched on a lot. And one of the things that stuck out to me was this idea about having to, within your community, self-report who is being impacted by COVID. And so, and we noticed very early on that there was a lack of data on like a racial or ethnic background. And like, how does that impact our ability to really report on what, how these issues are playing, how the pandemic or different issues are playing out in various communities? And for that, I'd like to turn back to Orlando. You know,
I'm so sorry, y'all. I have to jump off because I have another community meeting. I apologize. It started at 4 o'clock and I was like, okay, let me push it 15 minutes. So I just want to say, one, thank you all for organizing this because I think it's been a really helpful conversation that I don't really know in other contexts has been had. And just thank you for inviting me to be on despite not being a journalist. So I'm very honored. I appreciate it.
This conversation, I feel it was really important to hear your voice, and
Awesome.
we'll be in touch later. But yeah, like I said, moving on to Orlando, I mean, what have you noticed within like the African American community and the ways that the deaths and the specific impact has been having within the Black community? And like, how do you, as a journalist or someone who's engaging publicly, how do you address that? How do you look at it?
Intra-community conversations and telling folks to wait for the facts and wait for trusted sources. I think Andrew posed a really good question. And so we are a multimedia platform. Our news, we have a website, but we also put news out on social media platforms and things of that nature. And, you know, most recently I can remember just, you know, 2 instances where misinformation had spread like wildfire. One being the Kwame Kilpatrick story about him possibly being released from prison due to COVID concerns. And most recently, the police killing of Hakeem Littleton on Detroit's West Side. Both instances, Bridge Detroit, were seeking out facts before we decided to post anything about it because we're trained and we're professional. And I think the best way to sort of curb the tendency to want to be so there are a few things going on. There's a tendency to want to break the news, right? Again, we are a service journalism organization. We'll leave the breaking news to the dailies. What we want to do is have complex, nuanced conversations and analysis about what's happening in communities. And so we're not interested in breaking the news. We're interested in getting it right and telling a different kind of story. I would say the second effect that this has had, and Nargis brought up an amazing point, is the trauma around losing cultural normativity, right? As Black folk, it is how we transition our folks from life to death is super important to us, right? Especially if you Black and from the church. You know, we have a whole, you know, ritual, a funeral where we fall out in the casket and we grieve, and we grieve in a very emotional and charismatic way, and that has sort of been snatched from us. But also the other piece is, you know, we private too, Nargis. We want folks, you know, to really know. But, you know, in Detroit, our first question is, you know, what happened and who got the body? You know what I mean? Like those are the questions that we sort of ask first as a community, and we get our information that way. Now, daylighting that information is dependent upon the family. I lost a really close friend in the early stages of the pandemic, Marlo Stoudemire, and his wife decided to leverage their relationship with Henry Ford Health System to help pump out that message. We knew as his friends and people who were close to him what was happening, but we all knew because it was a cultural norm. Now, we ain't gonna share that widely. We gonna wait for her. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that having these inter-community conversations is important. I think what Outlier and some of the work that Sarah and Candace has done to train citizens as journalists, citizen journalists, and to ask the crucial questions is absolutely imperative. Citizen journalism is important, but we also want to make sure that we are training our citizen partners to make sure that, you know, they're vetting information, asking the right questions, and we're getting it right. What almost happened in Detroit in the wake of the death of Akeem Littleton was absolutely frantic and scary, and we don't want that to happen again, right? So how are we pumping out the information? We're constantly asking ourselves. The other thing about Bridge Detroit is, you know, some of us are quote unquote influencers on social media. I have a sizable following, and a couple of other colleagues. I mean, Stephen is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He has quite the following. Also leveraging our personal networks when necessary to pump out the much needed information that will get to our communities faster.
Right, exactly. No, that's so important. And I think that, first of all, we're running out of time. I think we could go on about this for hours. There's so many layers in talking about misinformation and data voids, and how do we, how do we combat that within our own communities with, you know, as journalists, as POC people. I'm gonna take one final question, then we're gonna close it out. And it's an important question. It's directed to Bridge Detroit, but also Nina can chime in here as well, talking about, well, the important thing, like, how do you pay for this kind of journalism? What if you could talk a little bit about the financial models for a more just media and information ecosystem? You know, there's a growing number of independent news organizations in Detroit that are trying to combat misinformation, and that are trying to, you know, center the voices of communities of color in a way that traditional media does not, frankly, have the capacity for anymore. But how do you support that without, you know, injecting philanthropy money each and every year? I know we're all pretty familiar with that landscape.
So this is for Bridge, okay.
But I think, I think that Nina can.
I can probably comment too, but
yeah.
Well, Nina, do you want to go first, or I'll yield to you to go first. And then
okay, I'll go first. I don't know. That's something that I think we're trying to figure out. every day. Right now, you know, I feel like Planet Detroit was fortunate to tap into some foundation grants. Through that, we're trying to build our partnerships and leverage it to grow audience. Hopefully, you know, we can gain some membership, and that's growing slowly. We haven't really put effort behind it, but we don't have, you know, an endowment or a big startup grant or anything like that. It's a lot of me doing other freelance work to try to sustain it at the moment, which I know Serena can relate to. And you know, that may be fine for a time, but it will get, you know, it's definitely tiring. I think that, you know, some of the things I'm looking at for business models, I'm really interested in cooperative business models where a community can have a stake in the entity, in the enterprise. I don't know exactly what that might look like, but I think that can align. If you can align that business model with your goal, I think you're more likely to potentially succeed in that way. Although I don't think the revenue possibilities are huge there, I think that there's something to that. Originally, my thought was to be nonprofit, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily the direction that I want to go, because nonprofits are really top-down organizations, and at the end of the day, you know, you have a board and you have, you know, a kind of a hierarchical structure. I think that there's got to be some other models out there, so we're very much experimenting. But anything that we can do to provide revenue opportunities that bring the community in, whether they're able to financially support, whether there's like, I saw a model the other day where there's, you know, like kind of a group membership where maybe a block club can join, that kind of thing, I think has potential. Takes a lot of work. And right now, I think, you know, as Serena knows, I'm doing 6 jobs. So I don't know, but I'm thinking about it. I think there's opportunities out there, and I think we need to figure them out.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the name of the game, what you just said, is experimentation. We're certainly know we're close to being able to crack that code. If we could, we wouldn't be having this discussion right now, to be quite frank. A lot of us are working in the independent and nonprofit and smaller scale. Definitely Bridge is one of them, who are kind of pioneering ways that we can share stories and actually sustain them, and really get to preventing the spread of you know, of misinformation and filling these information voids. Definitely. We've run out of time, but I just wanted to go ahead and make sure that we're providing you guys with the information to get in touch with us. I'm going to shoot out everyone's emails in the, go ahead and send that out in the chat, and please get in touch with us on an individual basis. I know we weren't able to reach everyone's questions, and I'm sure this has opened up a whole world of other thoughts and ideas, and you're going to want to follow up with all of us. I thank you so much for all of your guys' participation. Nora, you've been a gem to work with to put this together and get the word out. And I hope to see you all very soon, hopefully at some point in real life, but we'll see. But thank you again so much, and you guys be safe, okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have an amazing day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.